Hello U.S. history students, welcome. Today we have lesson 9.6 and the focus for today is a figure who did not leave behind necessarily a long list of accomplishments, but did leave behind a massive cultural legacy and a political legacy in certain ways, a political style or political template that became very influential, and that person is John F. Kennedy. And so I want to look at this person today in his presidency and a key moment in his presidency and what he represents, and then we'll step back to kind of consider what it all means. The way to contextualize John F. Kennedy in your brain is to just sort of return to that sense of the post-war optimism, confidence, this feeling that America is a nation that is sort of like youthful in nature and ready to sort of to take our place on a world stage. And John F. Kennedy is like as a political figure, he appeals to Americans because he seems to fit that so perfectly. JFK's youth is a key part of his appeal, right? He's the youngest person ever to be elected president. Theodore Roosevelt became president at a younger age, but that was due to Willie McKinley's assassination. And like Theodore Roosevelt, Kennedy introduces a new ingredient into the political mix, and that is the idea of, I guess, coolness in a certain way, right? Sort of a cool, calm, optimistic spirit that, like, with this guy, we can figure out anything, right? And so, you know, where Theodore Roosevelt introduced charisma into politics, Kennedy certainly introduces that. But Kennedy introduces a coolness into politics. And that is a mix that Americans find that when we can get it, when we can get our hands on it, we like it. So when you're that young and you become president, you probably don't have a long resume. And it's true, Kennedy's resume was not long. He was still an impressive figure, all right? So he came from a very, very wealthy Massachusetts family. His father had been in the Franklin Roosevelt administration. His father had served as an ambassador, and his father basically decides, you know, one of my boys is going to be president of the United States, right? And his father is sort of like a mover and shaker in the Democratic Party, and so his dad is gearing things up for that to happen. And Kennedy's older brother, or John F. Kennedy's older brother, died in World War II, and so, you know, John Kennedy now is the next man up, and Kennedy served during the war, and he didn't serve, you know, quietly or sort of doing some bookkeeping. He was in the Navy, he was a legitimate war hero. He saved lives as commander of a PT boat, and when he got out, his father's like, and now we begin the process of you rising for the presidency. And his dad sort of cleared the way for Kennedy to run for a House seat in Massachusetts, and then, you know, after he serves in the House for a little bit, then he runs for a seat in the Senate, and then he gets to the Senate and he drinks a cup of coffee and he's like, all right, then let's run for president, right? I mean, he's an ambitious son of a gun, and he's had his father and his father's political money and political connections pushing him along. Kennedy had this image of a youthful confidence and charm and charisma and intelligence, and he had all that, and he had it in spades, right? He's like our most charming president ever. His own personal life was somewhat reckless. He was a hard partying person who was obsessed with being with, you know, Hollywood stars or sleeping with Hollywood stars, and he was reckless. All right, he was reckless in how he treated others and his marriage, and he sort of sometimes acted as if or seemed to believe that like regular conventional rules didn't apply to him, and sometimes that approach really hurt him or got him into trouble, but the public never saw that, right? And if the media saw it, they sort of looked the other way on it because they were so charmed by him. Some images here as Kennedy ran for president in 1960. He's running here against Richard Nixon. Now, he and Nixon are roughly the same age, within a couple of years, but I mean, generationally and in terms of their appeal, you know, Nixon seemed 15 years older. And in this famous televised TV debate, the first ever televised presidential debate, Kennedy has every hair perfectly in place. He's wearing the makeup for the TV cameras. Nixon was feeling a little bit under the weather. He didn't wear the makeup. He started to sweat through it. He's got a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. Just look at the body language and how they're seated, right? Kennedy knew how to project an image of, I've got this. We've got this. I've got an answer for this. I know how to do this. I can think on my feet and I can do anything I want. And the thing is, Richard Nixon is a smart guy too, who has a very successful political career, but like, he was never charming. When Richard Nixon would smile, when Kennedy would smile at you, it just made you feel like, oh wow. When Richard Nixon smiles at you, it makes you feel like he's just tricked you, right? It's just like, they just had very different styles. And this election was close enough that even though Nixon had a much longer resume, all right, Kennedy on a thinner resume is able to sort of get by on style. And I'll say that notion of what is a president's image is something that is so essential today. It really has grown to Americans like to be communicated to at the level of image or style. John F. Kennedy, his wife Jackie, man, they look like movie stars. Look at this. It's amazing. In the Cold War, this is like the ultimate Cold War message of, this is our president and our first lady. What does your president look like, right? I mean, we produce Hollywood movie stars for our political leaders. And today, a Barack Obama, our previous president, was maybe closest to Kennedy in terms of like his political style was about kind of a confident, youthful, calm coolness, right? And that sense of, I've got this, we've got this, I can figure this out, I know how to get through this. All right, Donald Trump isn't cool in any sense like that. He certainly is not like has movie star looks, but Donald Trump does the style thing anyway, or he does an image thing. That's why his chin is always sticking out, and that's why I was even doing Google image searches, and almost all of them, at least all of them that are released by the White House, are him looking stern, right? Because he's like, I'm the guy that's going to come in and bust it up, right? And that's my image, and in a sense, he doesn't even need to say anything to the American public or give speeches. Like, these pictures kind of send that notion, and the pictures speak to us at the level of the heart, which is why sometimes these things can become political idols. Our heart speaks to us more loudly than our head does often. And like, if a president or political leader finds that right image that hits people here or sometimes at the gut level, the public's just like, yes, that, I like that. And Kennedy is the first time when we really see that chemically take off in the public. Kennedy doesn't get to be president for very long, right? He'll be president for less than 3 years. During that time, some fateful stuff occurs. I'm going to tell you about 2 incidents. The first one is, I note here, it's a fail, right? Kennedy blew it. Now, to explain this story, I have to back up for a second. So, Cuba, on the map, Cuba is just off the southern coast of Florida, 90 miles away from Florida. In the 1950s, the Cuban government fell and was replaced by Fidel Castro, right? A communist dictatorship. And in the Cold War, this is extremely alarming, embarrassing, whatever phrase you want to use for the United States, that like a country 90 miles off our shore now is ruled by a communist dictator. And so it's very much in the interests of the United States to not have Cuba be communist anymore, not have Fidel Castro be in power down in Cuba. And Fidel Castro is no good. I'm not going to go into that. When Kennedy becomes president, he is sort of given a plan by the CIA. This is like, here's a plan we have for how we can remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. Now, the CIA had presented this plan to Dwight Eisenhower, the previous president, right? And Eisenhower looked at it and said, this thing is half-baked, guys, we're not going to do this. And he hands it back to them. Kennedy is green, all right? Kennedy doesn't know everything yet, right? He's inexperienced. I mean, he's only 43 years old. He's my age, right? And he's like, he has not been around the block in the way that Dwight Eisenhower's been around the block. Dwight Eisenhower can say, look, I planned D-Day. I know when you need to go back and revise this some more. Revise this plan some more, right? It's not ready. And Kennedy doesn't know any better. So Kennedy gives the go-ahead for this CIA plan. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. All right, we're going to take some Cubans who don't like Castro, and we're going to arm them and train them, and we're going to send them over, and they're going to take over Cuba, and they're going to depose Castro, and then we'll get a more friendly American-backed government in power. It's a total fiasco. All right, it doesn't work at all. The Cuban rebels get routed. Castro is able to sort of laugh and say the Americans tried to topple me, but they couldn't. They got embarrassed. And how do you like your sexy president now, America? Right? Like your President Kennedy, he approved this plan and it didn't work. And Kennedy has to go in front of the American public and say, it's true, this was our plan, this didn't work, and I take responsibility. The best thing you could say about Kennedy here is when he made a mistake, he took responsibility for it. He said, this was my fault, the buck stops here, I won't make the same mistake again. Meanwhile, from back in Moscow, the Soviet premier is a man named Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev he's been around the block, all right? Khrushchev is sort of from Eisenhower's generation, and Khrushchev is looking at this guy Kennedy and saying, the Americans just elected a movie star, right? And that might work for their style of politics, but this guy can get steamrolled. Like, we were afraid to push Eisenhower too hard, but this guy Kennedy, I think we can steamroll. And that leads us to what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis will end up being Kennedy's finest hour, but it's born out of Kennedy's initial disaster with the Bay of Pigs. In October 1962, so Kennedy has been president now for a year and a half. Army intelligence gives the president this information that says, on the island of Cuba, the Soviets, there's now a Soviet military installation on the island of Cuba, 90 miles off the shores of the United States. And we have these satellite pictures here that show us that they are installing long-range missile bases. And it's unclear exactly how long it's going to take for them to get these missile sites, these missile erectors, ready to rock and roll, but it's a matter of weeks, right? Within weeks, the Soviet Union could have these nuclear missile sites set up in Cuba, right off our shores, which is the equivalent of like they've installed a gun right next to the United States' head. This is a really aggressive move by Khrushchev to go to Castro and say, hey, from one communist to the next, how about we set up our missile sites here? And Castro's like, sure, that'd be hilarious, right? Let's do it. And this is really, there's been this sort of like unsteady balance of power, we know, between the two. But now Khrushchev is making it, this is a major gambit by him, right? To gain a sort of massive leverage over the United States. And the question now for Kennedy is, how do you respond? What do you do here, right? And so you have this period that lasts about 14 days, in which Kennedy goes to the American public and levels with them and says, here's what's happening. Here's what we are going to try to do. You can look at this map here and see this image, like if those sites had been completed, the amount of the United States that would be within range of those missiles, which is about half the United States and certainly more than half of our population, was in range of those missiles now. And so all it would take from the Soviet end is to push one button and they could hit us before we could hit them. And so what are Kennedy's moves, right? Does he declare war on the Soviet Union, right? Do we like nuke that site and then like invite a nuclear response from them? How do we not provoke them? Certainly the Soviets are provoking us, but how do we stop them without provoking and escalating something further where we end up in a nuclear conflict, right? Especially how do you do this when the last time that you sort of tried to get tough, it ended up blowing up in your own face, damaging your political position and your geopolitical position. So Kennedy's sort of trying to carefully manage this. You've got a lot of people advising Kennedy during these days, right? And in general, the Army is advising a more aggressive approach, and Kennedy is looking for a blended approach, right? Kennedy responds with strength, saying, here's a red line, cross that at your own peril, and also with some behind-the-scenes diplomacy, saying, what can we give them that would make them back off here? Kennedy's like, we did not provoke this. This is, the Soviet move here is a reckless and provocative threat to world peace. And he says, we are putting in place a blockade around Cuba, all right? So the United States will put a naval blockade in place, and as more Soviet ships approach the island of Cuba, we advise them and we instruct them, do not attempt to break this blockade, all right? Any attempt by the Soviets to break this blockade will be met with full nuclear retaliation. Don't push us on this, all right? You've already got these sites half built. As you send in more supplies, we're saying we are not allowing you through. At the same time, through back channels, he's saying to the Soviets, what can we do for you that would allow you to save face and back away from this? All right? And what they end up figuring out is the United States says, how about we remove some missile sites from Turkey? Right? The nation of Turkey, which is somewhat close to the Soviet Union. How about we remove some missile sites from Turkey, and then you guys will remove your sites, your potential sites from Cuba, and we could each say that we're backing down in a certain way, and that allows you, the Soviets, to save face and not just sort of have to admit humiliating defeat. But there is, for a while, this sort of stare down as the Soviets are approaching the blockade, and every day it's like they're getting closer. What is going to happen? Are they going to try to break the blockade? Finally, after about a week of the stare down, Khrushchev orders the ships to turn around. The crisis passes. Khrushchev, who had estimated that he could roll Kennedy, actually is removed from power by the rest of the Soviet Politburo. Right? They say, you know what, that didn't work, and now we look a little bit worse. And so Khrushchev loses out from this gambit now. Right? So the Bay of Pigs is a disaster for Kennedy. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a disaster for Khrushchev. And Kennedy's able to sort of like come out of it without his hair being mussed, so to speak, and just say, we did it. And you do look back today and you say, that was as close as we ever got to nuclear war. That week in 1962 was as close as we ever got, and the American president kept his cool. A year later, he would be dead. John F. Kennedy was, of course, assassinated in November 1863 in Dallas, Texas. This was a traumatizing moment for all Americans who lived through it. It's one of those where were you when this happened kind of things. Some of you even wrote your formational research paper about grandparents' memories of what happened where they were when Kennedy died. And I know my own parents have their stories about being in elementary school and their principal coming in and telling them that the president has just been killed and may it never happen again. It's an awful thing. Texas was going to be it was a contested state in the 1964 election. It could go either way, and so Kennedy was there to shore up some Southern support. And he's driving in this open-top limousine. Some shots get fired from nearby. The man that shot him was a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was a former U.S. Marine. He's a former sniper in the Marines who had been dishonorably discharged from the Marines. He had tried to defect to the Soviet Union. Of all things, he was a Marxist. When he tried to defect to the Soviet Union, he sort of shows up saying, here I am, I bet you guys are happy to see me. And they get some look at him and they're like, who is this guy? What is this about? And they don't want him, right? Nobody wants him. And so all this sort of disaffection turns into this plan where he just broods and reads his Marxist magazines and polishes his gun and decides he's going to kill the president. Now, all kinds of answers remain about what Oswald was doing and who his connections were and why, because because his own connections in the past were murky, and then B, 2 days after he kills the president, Oswald himself is shot while the police are transferring him. They're trying to transfer him from jail to a courtroom, and when they're doing that, this strip club owner named Jack Ruby steps out of a crowd and shoots Lee Harvey Oswald. So you have the country grieving a president who seemed to embody youthful optimism and confidence, a president who had a young and beautiful family, and now you're going through this sort of trauma of watching them grieve their father. And of course there's conspiracy theories that will probably never die about who Oswald was working with, or who he was working for, or who else was trying to kill the president. And in part, these arise just because the central story, and the one that the evidence primarily seems to point to, which is just that there was this guy named Lee Harvey Oswald who says he wants to kill the president, and then he went ahead and did it, and then never denied that he did it. It just feels so random, right? And that there must be, if there's a conspiracy creates a story that seems to mean something more, right? And there's it has more narrative power to it, and sometimes life doesn't have narrative power, right? Or it doesn't seem to. And something like this rando nut job named Lee Harvey Oswald killing our beloved cool president doesn't feel like it has any narrative power. It just feels like, what? And so people try to grab onto conspiracies to hold on to. The fact that it's been whatever it's been, 50, 60 years since this happened, and no further evidence has leaked out, would seem to indicate, with every passing year, it seems more and more like it crystallizes around well, maybe it just was this Oswald guy. Kennedy's death seems to be kind of a transition point between the happy, crisp optimistic 50s and early 60s, and then the stuff that's to come later on, like the youth rebellion and counterculture, the Vietnam War, the Vietnam controversy, the Vietnam protests, all the stuff that's going to come in the late 60s. It's pretty easy to just point to the Kennedy assassination as kind of our chapter point, the end of one thing and the start of something that was a little more troubling. So that's all of our material for this week. I look forward to seeing what you guys write on your Google Classroom exit ticket responses. And otherwise, I hope you guys have an excellent weekend. Take care.